Hello and welcome back to the Purple Chair podcast, the podcast by youth for youth on how we end FGM and gender-based violence. I'm your host, Sherifat and MEP, and in this episode, we will talk about allyship and ending FGM. Allyship is critical for ending FGM, as this mission requires collective action from a range of individuals and groups who are committed to promoting gender equality and human rights. FGM is a deeply entrenched practice that is often supported by cultural norms, traditions, and beliefs. In order to successfully eliminate FGM, it is essential to build a broad coalition of allies who are willing to work together towards a common goal. In ending FGM, it is important to mobilise through collective action and bring together a range of people who have different backgrounds. By allies and people who are directly affected by FGM working together, we are able to not only mobilise through understanding their different perspectives, but also allies are able to bring and use potential privileges that they may have to assist and amplify the voices of survivors. Allies could be people who work in healthcare, people who work in politics, people who work in education, as well as just your everyday person, to be honest. I think men, for example, could get involved, women who are not necessarily from affected communities, also just anyone that's passionate about gender equality and ending gender-based violence. If you are listening to this episode and you are somebody that works with FGM or could potentially in the future, it would be great to really build your ability to be an ally by learning about FGM. To do so, you could join the End FGM eCampus, which is being developed by End FGM EU and their partners and should be out in 2024. According to Harvard Business School, allyship is a lifelong process of building and nurturing supportive relationships with underrepresented, marginalised, or discriminated individuals or groups with the aim of advancing inclusion. Allyship often requires the ally to recognise their privilege and extend understanding and support for individuals who have a different lived experience from them. It also requires a trauma-informed approach where allies ensure they do not cause further harm or re-traumatize survivors. A good example of this is an ally having a language skill that perhaps they could provide to assist somebody with booking an appointment, acknowledging that perhaps the person that doesn't have this language skill could be stigmatized or discriminated against. Allyship can take many different forms and can involve individuals, organisations, governments and other stakeholders. Some ways in which allyship is important for ending FGM. One way that allies could help is through raising awareness. So having discussions around FGM and informing people in their immediate and wider circle about the cause. Also through just sharing different ways in which people could learn and educating people around them. Another form of allyship that people could get involved in is advocacy and policy making. So advocating for policies to reflect the needs of survivors and also affected communities. Also, while raising awareness, it is important that allies are able to challenge existing social norms around gender-based violence and specifically FGM through destigmatizing some of these norms and also attempting to dismantle them. It is important that allies acknowledge some of these norms exist and actively do the work to unlearn them and also not reproduce those harmful stereotypes. So somebody that I know that is a really good ally around gender-based violence is, well, one of my male friends actually. So somebody who is not necessarily directly impacted by sexism, but acknowledges the harm in which it causes, as well as some of the societal norms that perpetuate certain practices. They are a particularly good ally because they give space for survivors and people who are affected to speak and attempt to amplify their voices through, talking to people who have decision-making power that they know, as well as actually sparking conversations within their own household, speaking to their dads, their uncles, often people who may not be so willing to listen to a woman. A particular way in which this person in my life shows up for people is through, I think most importantly, like giving a listening ear. So when I myself have wanted to confide in him around either just the frustrations of gender-based violence or the ways in which it has directly impacted myself, he has always given a listening ear and really just given space and safety to not only, I guess, offload, but not speak over me and tell me how I should feel or try and educate me because, for example, he has, a degree and he's incredibly smart, but kind of not necessarily intellectualizing my experience just because he thinks he knows a lot and he calls himself an ally, but instead shows up. Speaking to people who work in charities, I have seen people, for example, wanting to take up space or take up a certain opportunity that perhaps would be better suited for somebody who has direct lived experience, and speaking over people who have lived experience or speaking on their behalf, even though they were not necessarily asked to do so, or they could have necessarily tried to amplify the voice of somebody who is a survivor, for example. I don't think we can end FGM without allies. Ending FGM and the work that is being done by affected communities and survivors of FGM is incredibly challenging. Survivors often face barriers and perhaps are not welcome in certain spaces to advocate for the needs and support that they want. As a result of this, allyship and collective action could really aid the movement and also enable different people to learn about the cause and join as well. It is very important for decision makers to be active allies, as communities and affected communities in particular are doing incredible work on the grassroots level. And to aid this work and to ensure it can continue, it is important that there is support. And a big way that decision makers are able to support is by implementing policies and procedures that really reflect the lived experience of survivors and also aid them to keep doing the amazing work they're doing. We cannot talk about allyship without talking about saviorism. A big difference between the two is the acknowledgement that affected communities are made up of people and humanizing them and humanizing their cause rather than using a cause to make yourself feel better. And I think it's called the warm glow effect, where people feel a warmness and feel really good when they do good for others. So for example, if somebody gives to charity, that warm fuzzy feeling of doing something good. And the effect really looks at the fact that some people may only do good things to have this feeling rather than because they actually care about people or they care about people's humanity or even recognize their suffering and are passionate about ending it. The trap when you only do these type of things to make yourself look good is that you find yourself only doing it when you're feeling low and kind of picking and choosing when is right for you to speak out or to give or whatever the case. Another trap is really making yourself the center of the cause rather than centering those who are affected and thinking about the ways in which you can end it. When you have this good feeling around helping people who are suffering, for example, you don't necessarily want to end their suffering if their suffering ends, then you have no means to make yourself feel good. It is totally normal and human to feel good when doing good and when giving back to people. So that is definitely valid. But it is important to remove yourself from the center and center those who are in need or could use some assistance in some way. And it's important that the fuzziness that comes about when doing good is not your only motivation in doing good, because at points that fuzzy feeling may not be there and the work is still really important to be done. Allyship is definitely a journey, and it's something that I'm still learning about day by day. An instance in which I would say I had some learning is actually when I was looking at a job, for example. I was looking at a job application, and it was based, I believe, in Ethiopia, and it was open for people who have African passports or have African nationality, which technically I do have. But as you can probably hear from my voice, I was not raised in Africa. I was raised in the UK. And when I looked at the opportunity, the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, I have a Nigerian passport. I'm Nigerian, you know, that's a part of who I am. And that's definitely a part of my identity that I'm very proud of. However, also acknowledging perhaps my privilege and the fact that I was raised in the UK. I don't necessarily have lived experience living in Africa. I have visited Nigeria quite a few times, but almost as a guest. And I think in terms of the program I was looking at and somebody that would be able to add a lot of value, I didn't necessarily know if I was the right person to take that up. And I felt like being a good ally for those who still live in Nigeria or live in Africa, it would probably be best that I don't go for this opportunity, because I may not be able to bring the same nuance and level of understanding that somebody who was raised or still lives in Africa could bring. Some barriers to allyship can be stigmatization, so being stigmatized either for being an ally or speaking on a topic that is quite sensitive. I think it's important to recognize the sensitivity of certain topics, and me being here speaking about FGM, there definitely is a sensitivity that should be adopted when thinking and speaking about the practice. However, I would encourage people who would like to be allies to adopt this sensitivity, but to not let it deter you from getting involved and having important conversations. It is time to welcome our guest and a great ally of the movement to end FGM in Europe and beyond, MEP Evan Incir. Evin is a member of the European Parliament since 2019 and is serving on the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, the Committee on Development and Committee on Foreign Affairs. She is also involved in other parliamentary work, including working on Palestine and LGBTI rights, and she is the co-president of the European Parliament Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup. But most importantly, for our talk today, Evin is proved to be a great ally of the feminist movement and the European movement to end FGM. Hello, Evin. Welcome to our podcast, and thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We know that you are passionate about gender equality and the end of all forms of discrimination. Can you tell us what led you to be so involved, and how long have you been engaged in the fight against gender-based violence, and more particularly FGM?
Well, I think just being a woman and have been a girl is enough to really see the discrimination and the violence that women and girls is survivors of, many of us. As long as I can remember, I have been engaged in issues related to gender equality. That was also actually one of the reasons of why I decided to be politically engaged. And FGM is a heinous kind of violence against women and girls. It is one of the worst forms of breaches of fundamental rights, and therefore we need to combat these heinous violences jointly.
Thank you. Thank you. You are not personally affected by FGM, but you engage on this issue as an ally. Could you describe what being an ally against FGM means to you? What values should an ally uphold?
That's correct. I'm myself not a survivor of FGM, but of course, as many other women and girls have been through discrimination and a different kind of violence all through my life, not at least as also engaged politician. And we need to ensure that we fight all kind of violence against women and girls, and that includes FGM. FGM is a mutilation of a person's body. No woman, no girl should have its body mutilated by anyone. It is important for me, therefore, to be a part of the struggle for or against FGM and for women and girls' rights. Those who are survivors of it, but also be a part of the movement that prevents more women and girls being hit by it. I have also myself a Kurdish background from the Turkish border, but I know that in some other parts of Kurdistan, FGM has been and still, unfortunately, is a part of women and girls' everyday life. And women and girls are hit by it. So, of course, growing up, hearing some people being survivors of it, and as a very young girl, not really understanding how this can happen, and as a even a bit older girl and a woman, it led to me wanting to be a part of ensuring both combating, of course, this kind of violence, but also preventing it.
FGM is a form of gender-based violence and just another way patriarchy expresses itself. In this sense, do you agree that FGM must be included in addressing all gender equality?
Definitely, it's one of the worst kind of patriarchal consequences that exists, and it must be a part of the struggle against violence against women and girls, including domestic violence.
Thank you. And as a slight follow-up, as a woman, while you are not affected directly, do you feel like the persistent practice of FGM has an impact on you / on all women?
It is a part of sexistic and patriarchal system, and we need to combat the consequences all consequences that patriarchal system, of course, brings along. So even though I am not a survivor of FGM, it affects my everyday life because it's a part of depriving women and girls their right to their bodies, or I should say our right to our bodies, and discrimination against us. So it is a part of our joint struggle.
We need more people and more decision makers involved in the movement to end FGM in Europe. What would you reply to people or politicians who say that FGM is a niche issue in Europe that does not deserve the attention of EU institutions?
I would say that they haven't really understood what FGM is all about. It is about depriving women and girls their right to their bodies. And this also shows actually the importance of awareness increase about the reasons of FGM and the consequences of FGM and why we need to jointly combat it. But it is very clear that it is one of the most heinous kind of violences against women and girls, since it is about mutilation. It's about depriving a woman or a girl a part of their body.
Following on from that, what do you think is one of the big barriers for politicians or maybe even just everyday people in terms of them not only thinking that FGM is something that impacts all of us, but also in actually creating laws or support that meets the needs of survivors?
I would say knowledge, mostly knowledge. But of course, in some communities, maybe values, and but mostly I think it is about knowledge. So we really need, within the European Union, increase the awareness on this phenomena and the consequences of it. Because women and girls who are survivors of it are living with the consequences their whole life. So I think we need to talk about it more in schools, but also in political sphere. This needs to be higher up on the agenda. So I'm glad that the European Commission, when the 8th of March last year, 2022, presented the proposal to directive on combating violence against women and the domestic violence, also included the combat and prevention of FGM.
Absolutely. Thank you. I definitely agree. And I think that really this piece around knowledge is one of the big motivations behind this podcast and behind the whole series, actually.
You are doing a very good job with knowledge and awareness increasing, because, yeah, I think that's actually essential, even among the lawmakers, because I think there is a perception that FGM only happens outside of Europe, but that's not true. It also occurs within the European Union.
We know that some decision makers avoid talking about and working on FGM because they see the issue as culturally sensitive and hard to approach. Do you have any advice to overcome this challenge of cultural sensitivity?
No kind of violence against women and girls should be cultural sensitive. What we need to do, both within the European Union, within the 27 member states, as well as outside the European Union border, is to ensure that women and girls' fundamental right is respected. So that needs to always be prior to anything else.
At End FGM European Network, we believe that the voices and needs of affected communities must be centred in all the process that seek to tackle FGM. Can you share your thoughts about engaging communities directly affected by the practice?
Definitely, that's essential, because the communities hit by it also knows their consequences and also knows what could be the best tools to use to ensure to prevent and combat this the FGM. For me, it's always important to include civil society organizations and different actors who are knowledgeable on the different areas, and in this case, of course, FGM. It would be actually not only counterproductive, but it would be harmful also to not include those that are survivors of this. So this has been important also through when we have been discussing this directive and the different part of the proposed directive. I know that the Commission have also included different civil society organizations when they have before they decided to include the different parts of the directive, as well as I also met with the different actors when we were producing the position of the European Parliament that was actually adopted this summer.
What achievements are you most proud of when it comes to your work on addressing gender-based violence and FGM?
That we soon can have a joint EU legislation in place that puts minimum standards. But this means, of course, that those countries that have even better legislation can have better legislation, but all the women and girls must feel and know that they have access to justice and right to appropriate protection as well as support. So this needs to be a joint minimum understanding for, and the regulations and support in place in all across the 27 member states, because it shouldn't matter if you live in Sweden or Italy or Bulgaria or Portugal. You should know that if you are a survivor of FGM, you will have the same support all across the European Union. This, I think, is very important, that no woman and girl should feel alone and should be scared of seeking support.
Incredible. Thank you very much. So my next question really is, what would you say is next? What are you aiming to achieve in 2024 to get us closer to a world free from FGM?
I would have hoped that this directive, this piece of legislation that I'm chief negotiator for from the side of the European Parliament, would be in place already end of this year. But we unfortunately know that it will take a bit longer than that. So I hope that in the beginning of 2024, we will have legislation in place to combat violence against women and domestic violence that also includes combating female genital mutilation. And it shouldn't matter if the FGM is carried out within the European Union or outside of the European Union. If it is a European Union citizen or a habitant, then that person should always know that they have the support, the right to justice, and the right to protection. After the directive is approved, the member states will have 2 years to implement this directive. It will be maximum 2 years to implement this directive. And then they will have 7 more years before the Commission made its first evaluation. But I also should say, though, that we are right now on a negotiating phase, because these years could depend on if they become a bit lower or a bit longer, depending on how the negotiations goes. This 2 year of implementation is a proposal from the side of the Commission, and 7 years of before a thorough evaluation is also the Commission's proposal, while we from the side of the Parliament have actually demanded less years. While we will see what will be the outcome of the negotiations with the Council, that is the member states. But the process is, there will be around 2 years of implementation phase, and then around 5-7 years of before the first evaluation. After the first evaluation, it will be regular evaluations to ensure that the directive is not just piece of words on a piece of paper, but rather that we go from words to action to ensure that we confine this heinous violence to the dustbin of history.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Evin. So you were also a champion for intersectionality. Why do you think it's important to approach gender-based violence intersectionally?
I believe that it's essential. We know that if you are a woman, and if you have a certain disability, or if you have a certain background, or you belong to the LGBTI community, that you will not only be hit by discrimination, but you will be hit by discrimination even stronger. So to have these lenses on is very important. I had actually a discussion with one of my blonde colleagues, and we were talking about gender equality, and I think for some people, if you yourself maybe do not belong to that community, maybe you don't see the intersectional discrimination that exists, but when you belong to that community, you see it very clear because you are every day hit by it. So I know, for example, that if we reach a gender equal European Union, that doesn't mean that me as a person, as a woman of color, will have all my rights, because that also needs to go hand in hand with combating racism in, for example, the European Union, to ensure that women and girls in all their diversity and regardless of which group in the society we belong to, our background, sexual belonging, and so on and so forth, that we will all be emancipated and we will all have our rights, not only to 50%, some and some to 100%, but all equally 100%.
So I have a question around involving the youth, both politically, but also in terms of activism and speaking out against gender-based violence and also FGM. What would you say is the importance of involving the youth, and what are some practical ways that you think the youth can be encouraged?
Men's violence against women, it always starts with boys' violence against girls, because we are taught to act in a certain way. We are on a young age taught that some things are right and other things are wrong. We are taught that, I remember when I was very young, when I was a child, how the teachers were saying that don't mind that the boy is pushing you, he's just in love with you, or don't mind that they're acting in a certain way, because that's only boys will be boys. Or for example, when I was younger, my brothers were allowed to be outside much longer than I was. And, you know, experiencing this, seeing all this at a young age, you cannot not become angry as a young girl. Therefore, I think it's essential, because men's violence against women always starts with boys' violence against girls. And it always starts with what we tell our children is right or wrong. So this discussion of harmful practices and the importance of gender equality, it needs to start at early age.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you really bringing in your personal perspective of when you were younger as well. I definitely can relate. When I was growing up as well, I had all brothers actually, so definitely saw that dynamic within the household, but outside as well, for sure.
I also only had brothers, or have.
And in addition to what you said, I think the youth often bring a very unique insight into social issues in general, but especially gender-based violence and FGM. And I think it's very unfortunate that often youth voices are not listened to or nurtured in the way that they could be.
Yeah, definitely. But this is also one of the struggles we have, that young people and youth are not seen as grown-ups, and therefore it's not a big thing to listen to them. But of course it's a big thing, because young people knows this situation today. I mean, I was young 25 years ago. The situation on the ground in everyday life has of course changed significantly since 1 to decades ago. Therefore, young people all through history needs to be included in the decision-making processes. We need to listen to those who are living in the reality today and now.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to nurture youth voices, whether they're on the front line doing activism or just doing things within their local communities, or even just trying to have conversations at home. And I think that's another reason why this podcast has been so insightful. I've worked alongside many young women who bring their different perspectives. Again, to the intersectional point, we all hold different, nationalities and ethnicities and abilities and languages as well. So it's been incredibly insightful. Thank you very much. I have one last question. If you had to leave our audience with one takeaway on allyship and getting involved despite not being affected, what would it be?
We don't need to be hit by injustice ourselves, or the specific kind of injustices by ourselves, or inequalities. What we need to do is be an ally of each other. That's the only way we can ensure that all our rights will be a reality, all our fundamental rights. If we separate, we are weaker. If we join forces, we are much stronger. So we need to organize and mobilize jointly and act jointly for change to be possible.
Incredible. Thank you so much. It has been so insightful hearing your perspective, and yeah, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Purple Chair podcast.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you very much. And thanks for all the important work you are doing.
In today's episode, we spoke about allyship and what it means to be a good ally. We also spoke about saviorism and some things that you should avoid when trying to be a good ally. We spoke to MEP Evan Incir about her position as a powerful ally in FGM, and I hope that this episode has inspired you to take a stand for causes that may not directly impact yourself. And to quote Evin Incir, one does not have to be affected by something to care or to do something about it. Thank you for listening, and tune in for the next episode of The Purple Chair.